Hey guys, it's Meal Before Me, and I'm back with another food review. This time we're checking out Boston Market's frozen meals. Previously known as Boston Chicken, Boston Market is a restaurant chain founded in 1985 in Boston, Massachusetts. And the menu revolved around their signature rotisserie chicken with sides. They changed the name when they expanded the menu back in 1995. They've been bought and sold by different companies over the years, and I don't have one near me, so I don't know how popular they are, considering I never hear anyone talk about them or see ads for them anymore. And the only personal experience I have with them is that I passed through a town that had one a very long time ago, maybe 20 years, and I tried it and thought the sides were gross. That's a word you've heard me use for some of the meals I've tried on the channel, but it's not a word I had ever used for a brick and mortar restaurant, and I don't think I've ever used it again since, so my memory of Boston Market isn't great, but we're not trying food from the restaurant today. We're trying their frozen meals, which are owned by Bellisio Foods. The website shows 24 entrees and 3 sides. My grocery didn't have any of the sides, so that might be a new product, but I picked up all of the entrees available, minus the one that was sold out, which was the meatloaf, and the chicken broccoli and cheese casserole, which I intentionally didn't buy. Because when I do these reviews, whatever I get is my lunch, dinner, or breakfast until it runs out. So I'm not going to waste money buying something I know for a fact I don't want to eat, and I've always hated cheese and broccoli. That left me with 9 meals. All of them are $4.50 regular price at my store, but I got them on sale at $3.50, and that's keeping in mind that the packages weigh 7 to 15 ounces, so you're getting more food in some cases for the same price. But the important question now is, how does it taste? And as always with these grocery reviews, I'm not going to eat them in real time, I'm just going to show you the footage and tell you my thoughts over it, and I'll be rating these by taste and repeatability, meaning would I eat it again? Starting with the chicken pot pie. This one was interesting because the microwave instructions said to cook it inside the box. I assumed it had one of those foil-looking flaps in there for crisping, but it didn't, so I don't know how necessary the box is. For the record, the website says that their vacuum seal helps lock in moisture, maintain freshness, reduce freezer burn, and improve shelf life. This didn't have a seal, so I guess it doesn't apply to the pies, unless that was a mistake. So the pie was kind of messy with some of the filling squeezing out, and based on the color of the crust, it could have benefited from more browning, though the inside might have been overcooked at that point. So this one might be better for the oven than the microwave. Cutting into it, it was still crispier than I thought it would be, and it had a very buttery, salty, flaky upper crust that I really enjoyed. It did have a mild, floury aftertaste, but again, I think that could be addressed with more browning. Same with the bottom crust being flimsy and not really holding up. A different cooking method would improve that. The filling was thicker than some frozen pot pies I've tried. There were bits of carrots, peas, and corn that still had a nice toothy firmness to them. The chicken also had a nice texture. It wasn't that weird spongy one or that woody one that I'm used to from frozen meals. And there was a lot of flavor overall, like a buttery biscuit dipped in a rich, dense chicken broth. It's also weightier than other pot pies I've tried, like Stouffer's, though I do think Stouffer's has a larger size one that would match this. Regardless, for repeatability, would I get this again? Definitely. It's tasty and hearty, so we're off to a good start. Next was the chicken pot pie bites, and I was curious to see if they tasted anything like the pot pie I just had. The instructions said to microwave them on a separate plate, which I did. I just put them back on the tray afterward. They didn't taste like the pot pie, but that's mainly because of the shell. It had a battered flavor to it, and the filling was sparse, so the shell is what I tasted most. And what filling I did taste changed from bite to bite, since some of them had more chicken, some had more veggies, and some had mostly brothy goo. Also, while they do look brown and do have some crispiness, I'd personally toss them in the air fryer instead to see how that goes, but they were enjoyable and just the right size to take 1 or 2 bites out of each. For repeatability, if going just by taste, I'd say yes, but it's more like an appetizer than a meal, and the lack of consistent filling means I sometimes felt like I was just eating breading, so overall, the answer is no, I wouldn't get it again. And one thing I noticed is that the flavor of both was good, but in a way that tastes like it comes more from salt than from balanced seasoning. And a few things here did border on too salty for me, which is important because the amount of sodium something has doesn't necessarily translate into how salty it tastes. I've had plenty of frozen meals with over 1,000 milligrams of sodium, which is very high for me. I don't like to eat anything with more than around 200, but they manage to also be very bland. So if I'm going to eat something high in sodium, which I rarely do, I want it to at least taste seasoned, and these do. They just taste like most of that seasoning was salt. Moving on, next was the Swedish Meatballs, and from here, all of the microwave instructions were what you'd expect. Slit the plastic to vent, cook for whatever minutes, etc. Swedish meatballs are always a toss-up for me because I don't know what they're supposed to taste like. I only know that every time I've had them, not just frozen, but even from a restaurant, they taste different. So I'm not judging this based on what it should taste like, just on whether I like it or not. And compared to what I've tried from other frozen brands, the gravy here was less peppery and on the bland side, which I find Swedish meatball gravy to be in general. The meatballs themselves had a nice punch of beefy, porky flavor though that added a lot to it, so it's a shame that there were only 6 of them. The noodles were nice and thick with that al dente chew that I prefer, and I think most people do, to a lot of frozen meals where the noodles just fall apart. And for repeatability, I wouldn't get this again because it's an example of something that's high in sodium but light on taste. It isn't bad, it's just not as flavorful as I'd like. Next up were the turkey breast medallions with steamed vegetables, and the first thing that stood out was how watery the mashed potatoes were, to a comical degree. When you have to keep mashed potatoes of all things from spilling, it's not a good sign. I don't think I've ever had a frozen meal where the potatoes weren't a watery mess unless they were in their own compartment, but this was to the point where even mixing it in, I still wouldn't bother calling it potatoes. It was just potato flavored gravy, and it was also pretty bland, likely from being watered down so much. Thankfully, the turkey was great. It tasted seasoned and had a meaty home-cooked texture to it. It was just brought down by the potato bath. And the steamed veggies are what they are. You know, they taste the same to me in all of these meals, which is disappointing because steaming vegetables doesn't mean you can't season them in some way, especially when it's something like green beans that don't impart their own flavor to anything. A little salt and pepper would go a long way, and none of these frozen steamed vegetables ever taste like they have even that. I'd personally put the turkey and gravy together with the veggies on one side so the veggies can soak up that taste and leave the potatoes on the other side so they can retain their structure. Alas, that is not how they did it, so repeatability is no. I will say though that if the worst thing about a frozen meal is that it doesn't have enough flavor, you can always season it yourself, so that shouldn't be a deal breaker for you. My repeatability score is based on how much I enjoy a thing as is. So if I have to do anything to it to bring it up to my standard, even if it's something as simple as cracking some pepper, I'm probably going to pass on it. That doesn't mean it isn't worth buying in general. Anyway, next up is the Salisbury Steak, which tends to be the worst thing in every frozen brand I try. And I found it funny that the protein amount was scratched off on the side of the box like someone was trying to hide it. They all had random scratches in the packaging somewhere. I don't know if that's just how they were handled or if their printing process isn't great, but I'm not eating the packaging, so that's neither here nor there. But another thing I noticed with these meals is that the color of everything is more saturated, making all the gravies and sauces seem richer or more concentrated than the equivalents I've had from other brands. Like the cheese sauce here was really vibrant, and the steak had a deep brown gravy with bits of onion in it. While the grill marks are probably a lie, the meat did have a charbroiled taste to it that I liked a lot. It was very distinct from any other frozen Salisbury steak I've tried, and I find all of them bad, and I think the last time I reviewed one, I thought it was inedible. So this tasting good by comparison was a huge step up. The texture was also better than others as far as being more hamburger-like, but it still pulled away from my teeth like something packed tightly rather than naturally breaking apart. I'm not a fan of that. Where this one dropped the ball though was the mac and cheese. The sauce was smooth and creamy, but it was too salty. Not like I couldn't eat it, but in a way that made me feel like my blood pressure wouldn't like it. I tasted way more salt than cheese flavor, and I had to mix it with the steak and gravy to tone it down, and I still felt it was too much. The noodle texture was great, but without the sauce, it tasted like it wasn't cooked in salted water, and that makes a difference with pasta, because putting a flavorful sauce on bland pasta doesn't stop the blandness of the pasta from peeking through, at least in my experience. So I probably would have liked the mac and cheese more if half of the salt in the cheese sauce went into the water instead. For repeatability, I wouldn't buy it again, but if you're not as sensitive to salt as I can be sometimes, and you want a Salisbury steak option that doesn't suck, you may like this one. Next was the beef pot roast, and I really liked it. What stood out the most was the flavor of the beef. It was the most homemade tasting beef I've ever had in a frozen meal, and the sauce was absolutely pot roasty. Like, what pot roast should taste like? This is the closest I've had in frozen form. And the vegetables were perfect. I've mentioned before that I hate celery, but this is an example of celery imparting its flavor in the right way that enhances the depth and complexity of the gravy. So I love it here. In fact, my only complaint is that they were very stingy with the meat. It's also a great example of what I said they should do with the turkey, because the meat, veggies, and sauce are co-mingling in a delicious way on one side, while the potatoes get to stay solid on the other. That said, the potatoes were still a little bit disappointing here. They had very little flavor and had that frozen texture I don't like, where it's somehow mushy and gritty at the same time. The meat and veggies took care of the blandness, but there wasn't much to be done about the texture. And I feel like most of these companies need to rethink their mashed potatoes, because when you buy mashed potatoes as a side from the refrigerated section, they can sometimes have that same texture problem that the frozen ones do, but most of the time they don't. They're thicker, more buttery, and creamy. So whatever they're doing, these frozen brands need to do the same thing, then freeze it, because the mashed potatoes always taste like the packet kind, only if you use too much water and didn't cook it together, so the potato powder didn't fully absorb the water, it just sort of swirled around in it. Regardless, I did like the flavor of the meat and veggies enough that I'd get this one again. Repeatability is yes. Next up was the chicken fettuccine Alfredo, and you may have noticed that I struggled getting the plastic off some of these. It's just because they were still too hot to hold. But this one was a return to the typical world of frozen tasting meals. The sauce was bland with a funky aftertaste, almost metallic but not quite, and the broccoli made it worse, though I already said I hate broccoli with any kind of cheese. Alfredo sauce is no different. It's just a nasty combination, and the chicken, while seasoned well, had that awful woody texture to it that's present in most frozen brands, where biting into it is like biting into a hot dog with a lot of snap, only imagine that the entire thing is just casing with a snap. Like, you never get that soft, meaty texture inside. It's hard to describe if you've never had frozen meals, but if you have, you know what I'm talking about, and it's bad. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this one. The only upside was the noodles, and I can have noodles minus the ick for less money, so repeatability is absolutely not. Next was the sweet and sour chicken, and I didn't have high hopes for this one because the basic frozen brands tend to get Asian flavors wrong for me, or at least they all taste not great in the same exact way as if the same company makes all of them. They usually opt for sesame chicken and lo mein though, so I was excited to see sweet and sour chicken and rice. This one was the standout of the whole review. The sauce was delicious. It had that perfect balance of sweetness with a citrusy sourness that was bright and savory. The sauce was nice and thick, and it coated the chicken well. I was actually surprised by how flavorful this was, and without tasting salty, though I can still tell that it had a lot of salt in it. The texture of the chicken was decent too, because one thing I noticed with some brands is that the breading in meals like this one gives the chicken a really unpleasant, floury gumminess, especially with the smaller pieces, and that wasn't the case here. As for the rice, I really liked that as well. It was akin to those Uncle Ben's 90-second packs you'd get, only more firm, and the grains separated well while still being tender. There were some peas and carrots in there and what looked like bell pepper, but it didn't have a southwestern taste. It had that fried rice flavor with a hint of that more natural brown rice note. Basically, both were great apart and even better together, so repeatability is absolutely yes. This is likely one that I'll continue to buy if I see it on sale, since I always like to keep something frozen around for days when I'm not up to cooking. But last and close to least was the chicken Parmesan. This is one that most frozen meals get right enough, so I was shocked that I didn't like it here. The chicken had that spongy texture all of the chicken parm seemed to have, but the breading had a garlicky herbiness to it that tasted better than others. Unfortunately, the pasta sauce didn't cut it. Like, it tasted like something out of a can, not even a jar, a can. And what little cheese there was, and there was very little, had no taste. Spaghetti alone can't save that, because spaghetti alone isn't interesting, so this was another quick decision. Would I eat it again? No. For $3.50, I can get something with much better flavor and slightly better texture. Even the chicken parms I reviewed recently from other brands like Lean Cuisine had more zest and punch to them, and that's keeping in mind that the sodium count here is still pretty high. So, getting into my final thoughts, while I didn't like all of these, I'd still put these meals in the higher tier of frozen for the price, because they nailed a lot of things that most of the cheaper ones get wrong, and apart from the form factor, you could get away with believing that some of these were home cooked or picked up from the store rather than frozen. The portions are also pretty good for the price. So I'd say that Boston Market is worth trying, especially with there still being so many entrees I didn't have access to. But let me know if you've tried the frozen meals by Boston Market and how you felt about them. Also, if you decide to try one, make sure you go to the website, because they do have a page with a manufacturer's coupon. At least they did when I looked at it, and it never hurts to save money. Thanks so much for watching MBM, and I'll see you snackies when I'm backies.